Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to give it another minute here before we get started and let some more people get into the webinar here. All right. Um, Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're going to take a closer look at what happens inside your building water system during low occupancy and why educational facilities are especially vulnerable during those low occupancy periods. And we're going to walk through practical strategies to help you protect your facility and the people who occupy them. Before we get started on the webinar, I do want to do a quick poll for everyone on here. We just want to know, do you guys have a water management place at your facility? Go ahead and drop that in the Q&A box if you guys do or you don't. And while you guys do that, a couple housekeeping things. All questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. So as we're going through, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A box and we'll answer those at the end. If for whatever reason we run out of time and we don't get to your question, we will follow up with you individually afterwards. And then also we will send out a copy of the slides and a copy of this recording following the presentation as well. All right, so it looks like the majority of people are saying, yes, we do have a water management plan, which is great. We love to see that. So now I'd like to introduce Brian Pickett. Brian Pickett is the Senior Vice President of Operations here at IWC. Brian joined IWC in 2017, and he is recognized as an expert in Legionella risk management and water safety. During his time at IWC, he's developed over 500 water management plans and has led more than 1,000 remediations across the country for us. So with that, please welcome Brian Pickett. Brian?
Rachel, thank you very much for the introduction and for helping to host this afternoon. And thank you for all those who are attending this afternoon, wherever you may be from. We greatly appreciate you taking the time to join What Happens to Water in Unoccupied Campuses. So today we're going to be basically putting things pretty straightforward for you here with the overview and objectives. We're going to cover what's happened when water sits, how low occupancy impacts your systems, and then when you can actually do about it before it becomes a problem. So moving on is, how do we define low occupancy in education? Well, obviously you guys have a lot of low periods throughout the year, which could be resulted into absences, summer breaks, spring breaks, winter breaks, and extended closures during which normal operations are paused and facilities are primarily used very minimally. So think about one of your buildings during summer break. It's quiet, the lights are out, hardly anyone's there. From the outside, everything looks pretty fine, pretty comfortable. Things are looking good. But inside, your water system, your pipes, they're just sitting there, and maybe in some instances for weeks on end. So that's where your risk starts to build, and it's completely out of sight, completely out of mind. The important part is that water usage drops off significantly during low occupancy. So what actually happens inside your water system? So, Rachel, if we go on, is that, there's water stagnation. There's loss of the disinfectant residual if you're being supplied it from a municipality or even from a well system that you may have on your campus, and temperature fluctuations. Water begins to stagnate in the pipes. It's not moving, it's not flowing unless it's on a recirculation loop, which is typically on the hot water side of a building. Typically, we don't see recirculation loops on cold water sides of the systems. So the cold water is going to be more apt to sit and stagnate in a pipe when the occupancy is low and not being utilized. Disinfectant residuals, examples of disinfectants are like chlorine or chloramines. Some municipalities may use chlorine dioxide as a disinfectant residual. Those just start to dissipate, and in a water system, they can drop dramatically within minutes or hours. In just a few days, it's completely gone. And then temperatures fluctuate into ranges that are ideal for bacterial growth. So even though the building looks inactive, the water system itself becomes very biologically active in a facility where systems are being underutilized or low usage at this point. So why low occupancy creates risk is, obviously the water's just sitting there. It's not being used. As you guys have indicated in the poll that Rachel took there at the beginning, most of you do have water management plans, but are they being followed during these low occupancy times? So as you can see here, the hallway's empty, the dorms empty, the classrooms are emptied. You cannot forget about your water systems in times like these because it creates much bigger problems for you in the end. And what kind of problems are those? Is more what we call waterborne pathogens. And so the waterborne pathogens, there are hundreds of known waterborne pathogens. These include bacteria, viruses, and parasites, that can be transmitted through contaminated water. Obviously, the more known bacteria that we are more familiar with these days are those such as Legionella and Pseudomonas and non-tuberculosis mycobacterium. As far as viruses go, there's over 100 different viruses out there that are considered waterborne pathogens. And examples of those types of viruses are like the norovirus and the hepatitis A virus, or even the rotavirus. Those are all examples of a waterborne virus. And then parasites or protozoa. There's dozens of these as well that can be considered waterborne pathogens. And an example of that would be Cryptosporidium. So, I know that most of you are very familiar. You hear of the Legionella mostly because they become very active in the news. Legionnaire's disease cases, we've had multiple outbreaks all across the country this past year. So, being familiar with the types of common waterborne pathogens out there, is very vital to being able to understand. So when we go on, and everybody's heard or known about Legionella, and what is Legionnaire's disease? Legionnaire's disease is really a serious lung infection. We also refer to it as Legionella pneumonia, and it's caused by the Legionella bacteria. And Legionella bacteria, there are over 60 different species of Legionella bacteria. And the big ones that we're worried about is those known as Legionella pneumophila. And there are 15 different serotypes of Legionella pneumophila, of which Legionella pneumophila serotype 1 is responsible for almost 90% of all cases diagnosed in the United States. So how do you contract Legionnaire's disease? There has to be certain conditions met. There has to be a water source that is containing the actual Legionella bacteria. There has to be exposure that allows the contaminated water to enter the lungs. And then you have to have a susceptible individual with risk factors that increase their vulnerability. So in most cases, I like to utilize, water aerosolization. And the best way to understand water aerosolization is think about going home of an afternoon or an evening or even of an early morning, and you turn on your shower because you just really like to take a hot shower. And you turn that as hot as it is, and it starts getting steamy there inside in your bathroom. Well, that steam that you're actually seeing is actually breathable water mist. And so if that water is contaminated with Legionella bacteria, then now you have the means of inhaling that into your lungs because that water mist is breathable now and can enter into your lungs. That's the most common way or route of exposure to somebody. The second is aspiration. Aspiration occurs when somebody is actually drinking tap water that contains Legionella bacteria. And instead of it going down through their esophagus, it enters their trachea and goes down into the lungs. And that's an exposure method. And then a third way that's really common is somebody that is using like medical equipment, such as a CPAP or BiPAP machine. And obviously anybody can suffer from like sleep apnea where they're required to have a CPAP machine and there's a water reservoir that is attached to that machine. Ideally, with a CPAP or any type of medical device, you want to make sure that you are using distilled or sterile water in those and not just regular water from the tap, because that can increase your risk greatly of exposure. Now, acceptable individuals, in most cases, we're talking about somebody that is 50 years of age or older, has immunocompromised, may have a respiratory condition, maybe they're a smoker. But you also have to consider those that are diabetic. They're considered immunocompromised. And in today's world, diabetes is something that, is not just in older, it's in people of all ages. So, in universities and campuses across the country, you might have somebody that's susceptible based on them being a diabetic. So Legionnaire's disease is just, as I said, we refer to it as Legionella pneumonia. It is treatable if it's caught early enough. However, there are only certain antibiotics that will help to treat the disease. In most cases, when somebody's diagnosed with pneumonia, they might use just a broad spectrum antibiotic to help treat that person. But when you're exposed to Legionella bacteria, you have to be tested and treated with a certain antibiotic. So, moving on is, real world impact in schools. If somebody is, exposed, and the Department of Health may get involved, they may bring in the CDC if they choose to do so at their discretion because they need help. Um, they may impose water restrictions. So you might start, having to stop using water fountains and faucets and ice machines, showers, until further notice, unless you put in certain factors by replacing the water with like maybe bottled water. And maybe in order to continue showers, you may have to install a special point of use filter, which would have to filter down to zero point 0.2 microns in order to even make the water safe for you to be able to utilize it in your facility. So it could become, very, very expensive right from the get-go. So IWC has been involved in several colleges and universities across the country. One of the most recent was just this past year with Rose State College. It was one of the bigger ones that was in the news nationally. IWC obviously was mentioned during the press releases as we were brought in as their consultants, utilizing. And so what happened was with Rose State College, they had gotten notified after a senior living that wasn't even a half a mile up the road from them had reported a Legionnaire's disease-related death. And so because of it, that broke the news and into the area. And so it made the college start questioning, what can we do? We need to kind of like test our facilities, check to see what was going on, and see if we can, make sure that our campus is clear, that the water management plan that we have been doing is actually on the proactive side in helping to maintain and control Legionella bacteria within there. So they obviously reached out to IWC, got us involved. We helped them with the testing, and obviously, upon testing, we found that multiple campus buildings had elevated Legionella levels detected in some of their buildings. And so they began by flushing their buildings and trying to see if they could start by just flushing and trying to get rid of the bacteria. The campus did remain open. They obviously had guidance from CDC, the ASHRAE 188 standard that, obviously IWC follows very strictly. And then they consulted with us to do the next best step and making sure that they were guided through the process. So we obviously deemed the risk very low because, number one, um, there wasn't a case actually tied to their facility. It was just from being proactive from a case that was nearby. And so obviously we did what we call a remediation effort of the campus, of several of their buildings, actually all of them on the campus, to where we treated everything from dental equipment down to, showers and locker rooms, to the just even general garden hose fixtures. So, a hyperchlorination or a chemical shock treatment of the facility was completed. And then they did it with follow-up testing just to make sure that the remedial efforts that had been implemented were done. They did install filters during the time, prior to the sanitization, just to keep the college staff safe and making sure that they did the things in the right order, and just made sure that they were extra safe for their students. The next facility that was in the news, and this occurred back in June 2023, would have been the Kettering City School District's Roush Stadium Fieldhouse. And what was interesting here was that, there was 36 athletes that became ill. Students were all tested for Legionnaire's disease. They did find that Legionella bacteria was detected in the water at the city school. Um, the public health involvements there was very limited because there wasn't a confirmed case. And, the Department of Health really get involved when we actually have a confirmed case. But they did have prior history of Legionella, which was actually fatal back in 2019. And any facility that is out there, be it a college campus or a university, or, healthcare, or even just, general corporation, you should make sure that you take extra steps knowing if Legionella has ever been identified, because that risk, may not have resulted in a case or a death or anything like that in the past, but knowing that it was there previously could result in something in the future. So you always want to kind of be proactive. Water testing is typically done annually before the school year, and then, you want to make sure that if you have positive results, that it triggers some type of protocol, be it a disinfection, a flushing, and then just retesting to make sure that you get rid of the bacteria before school starts back up. Um, Another university that had an issue that IWC was a part of was the San Diego State University back in March of 2023. Ultimately, when they reached out to us, they had already had a confirmed death from Legionella pneumonia. This was also well known in the news and posted out there, and obviously for those that may have any type of special news alerts nationally, may have seen this come across your scroll. So it was identified that, upon testing and everything, that there was a source, and this source was the Exercise and Nutritional Sciences building and the annex for a comprehensive uh, testing that was completed. We know that this particular professor was associated with this building, and, after testing water sources, we were able to drill it down. Obviously, excuse me. Um, Aging infrastructure is a huge part of these problems that we find out. Remodeling that has been completed to where there was dead legs that were left that needed to be removed, and just, so IWC went in, we helped them with the treatment of the building, follow-up testing. There was some areas identified that, obviously they wanted to put some extra precautions on as such, and so they implemented a filter, a 6-month filter that they was able to put on their supply lines for some of their outlets because it's a minimal cost. It's one of those where you change it twice a year. It's not that expensive. It adds that additional layer of protection to the campus, and they're now confirming, they haven't since then, since 2023, there has been no additional Legionella identified because of the water management plan program that they implemented, the testing on, they chose to test on a quarterly basis so that they could ensure that, they're making sure that the water management plan that they've implemented is actually suffice and doing the things. And then that extra layer of protection in some of their higher risk areas, they implemented the filter change. Very minimalistic cost for them to move and to implement. So they felt it was the right thing to do. So what happens when you make the headline? Well, it's a PR nightmare. Obviously, you start getting questions, immediate health concerns. People start overreacting, especially if they don't have the education or the knowledge of what they're doing and how to manage these things. So, they get increased scrutiny from the public health agencies. And maybe if the public health has brought in the CDC or regulators, um, there's the potential for facility shutdowns or restricted operations. Obviously, being reactive is extremely costly, from the testing to possible filters to, maybe having to provide bottled water for drinking or bagged ice for usage to filters, and even the much larger cost in itself is just the remedial cost. It takes a lot of time and chemical and manpower to come in and to treat a building. Um, it also produces exposure to legal liability and potential lawsuits. I know that we have been involved with multiples of those across the country that has led to legal liability and potential lawsuits, and helping to make sure that they have a defensible ASHRAE compliant 188 water management plan in place. That is their first step and first place to start. Obviously, the media attention, it can hit multiple news agencies, from being on the TV to the live streams to the digital output of, newspapers. There's disruption to your daily operations and long-term planning. So it has a huge impact overall on what happens within your facilities and how you respond. Moving on, we're going to talk about prevention strategies before, during, and after low occupancy. So what are the key risk areas in school water systems? Obviously, from our consulting and being able to work with the various campuses and universities across the country, the areas that are most at risk are areas that have locker rooms and showers, science labs with eye wash stations and sinks, drinking fountains, bottle fillers, dormitories, if the campus has them. Obviously, that goes along with having showers because that's more the bigger risk. Decorative fountains, being able to maintain those on a campus, making sure that if they're filled with regular tap water, that they're being chlorinated. Hot tubs and pools, cooling towers. Obviously, cooling towers could be a seasonal for a community, campus or university, but also some places have them where they run year round. Challenges that universities and campuses across the country face is obviously aging plumbing systems, dead legs within their facilities. And when we talk about dead legs within a facility, we're talking about areas where water is not potentially always used. Drinking fountains maybe that are located in a locker room or someplace in a classroom that doesn't get used at all, nor is it on a part of a flushing program. We could call those dead legs. Dead legs, we also kind of refer to those as where areas may have been remodeled. What I see a lot of in facilities is that maybe there was a drinking fountain at one time in a hallway, and they decided, hey, this is underutilized or it's not doing what we need to, and they just remove it from the wall. And what they do is they leave that plumbing that comes down there to where it connected, and just valve it off. Well, obviously that becomes a dead leg, especially if it's not getting flushed on a regular basis, meaning somebody goes around at least once a week to actually run the water through that line to get rid of it. So those are items or areas that we can see as dead legs. Obviously, any remodeling that's done that is just left piping within the walls or ceilings that wasn't cut back to either a riser or a header, that all becomes a dead leg. So unless it's able to be flushed, you can look at things like that as such as a dead leg. Low flow fixtures. Excuse me. Um, so a lot of buildings that we come to try to get into the LEED certification program for water conservation. And so they implement things such as automatic fixtures where people don't have to turn on handles. They may have aerators on there that are produce a lower per gallon minute flow. Those tend to actually impede or allow bacteria to grow even more because the water flow has been restricted at that point. It flows slower, moves slower, and we want water to move. If we don't have water moving, it's going to give more of an opportunity for bacteria and biofilm to actually set up within a plumbing system. So those are challenges as well. Renovations, I kind of already spoke to that with the dead leg situation. Renovations are just, leaving piping behind and letting water sit stagnant in there. The reason a dead leg is very important here to think about is, say you've got your piping that runs along the header there and you've got the pipe coming over and then going down the wall. Well, that water that's sitting in that pipe that comes out and goes down the wall is sitting there stagnant. And as a building goes through pressure changes throughout the day, and what I mean by that is, water flow, people turning on and off faucets and fixture, that changes the pressure within a pipe. And if the pressure goes low enough, that water that's sitting in that dead leg could actually flow back into the main header. And then as it repressurizes, pushes it throughout the building. So it could lead any type of bacteria that was in that dead leg that started to go further into the building. So, and then obviously seasonal shutdowns and startup procedures or patterns. Those could be regarding cooling towers that may be on a seasonal. Are they being actually done appropriately? Are they shutting down and starting up? Are they being tested? Hot tubs and pools, if they're seasonal, is it going through the whole cleaning process, scrubbing, chlorination process to make sure that it's safe and being tested for the pH and the appropriate chlorine levels, and even decorative fountains. Those are all, seasonal shutdown and startup patterns, as well as, your dorms themselves being down from being empty over the summer or winter break. Are you doing the right things? How to control Legionella. We actually have an acronym that we use, and that is STAR. Excuse me. STAR refers to sediment and biofilm, temperature, age of the water, and residual disinfectant. So we worry about sediment because obviously from your city water supply, it naturally has some type of sediment that comes in, and it's typically in very fine particles. That sediment can go and get into a hot water heater and build up in the bottom of a hot water heater. It could get into the aerator of a sink, and it can get into a shower head. And as it gets into those areas and starts building up, now you've created an area where bacteria and biofilm can actually start setting up and creating that sticking point for waterborne pathogens to get into. With Legionella specifically, it loves biofilm, so if biofilm started on a piece of sediment that's entered in there, then it's going to have a food source. Legionella has to have a food source, and that biofilm just becomes a big old food source for it. And so it can start growing and colonize just in that from a simple piece of sediment. So making sure that we're dealing with sediment by cleaning aerators, shower heads, flushing hot water heaters. Temperature is big. Obviously, Legionella bacteria alone can grow between the temperatures of 77 degrees Fahrenheit up to 122. The ideal growth range for it is between 107, 108 to 113. That's where it will really, really grow. And so, that temperature, obviously, you have to watch your temperatures as you may have a scald protection regulation or a specific temperature that you can't go above. And so, obviously, if you have those kind of regulations for your campus or your university, you can't, circumvent that. But what you can do is make sure that if you have recirculation loops on the hot water system, that you're able to make sure that the water goes back to the hot water heater and it can be put through the hot water heater. You want to try to heat and store your hot water heaters at 130 to 140. And so on your recirc loops, and then you down mix it with a master mixing valve or even a point of use mixing valve to whatever temperatures you're allowed to put at within your facility. Age of the water. Obviously, that's where we're talking about the flushing, the water sitting in the pipes. It's the temperature may have been lost. It may have lost its disinfectant. So turning that water over at least once a week within your facility is huge. And then ultimately, the residual disinfectant. We want to make sure that you're getting the appropriate disinfectant from the city or municipality, and it's inside your facility. They're doing its thing. It will help at least to control. You may not be able to control all four of these items, but if you can control at least half to three-quarters of those, that should help to keep your water system in check. Okay. So when you start preparing for low occupancy, the focus is on maintaining control. You want to update your water management plan. You want to make sure that your water management plans are being reviewed at least on a yearly basis. And that is something that the ASHRAE 188 standard does mention and recommend, is that, you take the time to actually review your water management plan and make adjustments to it. If you've got new things that's been added into your water management plan, make sure that you're adjusting it accordingly. You want to make sure that routine flushing is done. You want to manage the water temperatures and maintain the disinfectant levels and monitoring systems where possible. The key message, with getting prepared for low occupancy is simply this: you can't just walk away from the system and forget about it. You have to be able to make sure that during those low periods of occupancy, you have a plan established that you can actually maintain your water systems so that they don't allow waterborne pathogens to actually set up within your system. During low occupancy, just make sure, implement the control measures in the water management plan. Keep the routine flushing scheduled. Make sure you keep the hot water hot and the cold water cold. Maintain those disinfectant. And if you have remote monitoring, as I know some facilities that we've been to actually do, they can actually have a third party remotely monitor some of these items, such as the disinfectant levels and the temperatures. I mean, if you've got somebody that's doing that, then that's a really good thing to be able to maintain. Um, Another thing, and I know we don't have it on here, but something that could help is auto flush systems. Having an auto flushing system in your facilities may be located at distal points that can help kind of turn over some of the water that may be in the main risers or headers. Those are all good things to make sure that you incorporate into a low occupancy period. Now that you've prepared for and you've gone through your low occupancy and you're getting ready to reoccupy, what do? You want to make sure that you give an extra system-wide flushing and recommissioning of the water systems. Targeted testing should actually be performed before you actually remediate or reopen your facility for the school year. Excuse me. This will just be to ensure that your water management plan program that you've implemented is actually doing the right things. It's controlling the waterborne pathogens, especially Legionella. You want to perform corrective actions and make sure you document. Documenting and communication is key to your water management plan programs, because if you don't document it, if you don't communicate it, then they can say it never happened. So making sure that it's a part of your water management plan and making sure that you do document everything. Um, CDC actually has really good guidance out there for reopening your buildings. Obviously, number one is big on the list. Make sure you have a comprehensive water management plan. Most of you have already indicated that you do. You want to make sure that your water heaters are properly maintained and temperature is correctly set. Flushing, as we said, flushing that building, cleaning all the decorative water features such as the fountains, the hot tubs, the spas, the pools, cooling towers. Make sure they're cleaned and well maintained, and that you have a water treatment program in place. That should include some type of biocide treatment for the cooling towers, and then just ensure safety equipment, fire sprinklers, eye wash stations, safety showers. All of those are clean and well maintained. Um, Regulatory and guidance landscape. What we're seeing more and more is obviously ASHRAE 188 is the standard that was developed for the United States. Um, It took a team of a lot of plumbing engineers and consultants 10 years to actually write the ASHRAE 188 standard. The 188 standard, Rachel, that's on the next slide, is to make sure that it establishes the minimum requirements for building water management programs. It does apply mostly to commercial, healthcare, and large residential, but it can apply to a campus as well, especially if a campus has healthcare as a part of their overall. So if you have like a doctor's office or a dental school, the ASHRAE 188 standard is really going to apply here for your colleges or your universities. Um, ASHRAE 188, they started writing it in 2005, and after public review, it took them 10 years for this to become the standard, and it became the official standard in 2015 for the United States. So it's a key component. It's what a lot of departments of health, the CDC, all reference is the ASHRAE 188 standard. So if you're not familiar with that, you should make sure that you are familiar with it and making sure that the key components that are supposed to be in there are in your water management plan program. That's, making sure your water management plan should establish a program team, making sure that you know who's responsible for what on your team and that there's a reporting structure, reviewing that annually, making sure that you've identified all of the hazards within your campuses and universities, and that you have control measures and monitoring procedures and processes in place, and that you also have corrective actions. And the verification and validation. Verification is making sure you document it and saying and doing the things that you say you're supposed to be doing as a part of your water management plan. And then validation. And folks, the true and only way to really validate your water management plan is through testing. Testing is very vital to a water management plan. Even though it's not always mandated, it is highly, highly recommended that you do the validation at least once a year to ensure that your water management plan is doing the things you want it to be doing. So Virginia, they're one of the states that requires school boards to maintain a water management program for the prevention of Legionnaire's disease at public schools, and the local school division. California actually, they had a legislation that they put out there in 2021-22. It was actually known as the Safe and Efficient Water Act. It was introduced by Senator Scott Weiner out there, aimed at improving water quality and efficiency. The bill was passed, but it got vetoed by the governor there in 2022, just due to some fiscal concerns. However, there's no statewide mandates for universities, college, or K through 12, but generally they focus on the CDC and ASHRAE voluntarily for local guidance. New York actually has some of the strictest out there in the country. They've got the subpart 4-1 out there that mandates New York cooling tower owners register units. They want them to make sure they create the ASHRAE 188 compliant maintenance program and plans, which is what they refer to as the MPP, and conduct routine testing. Obviously, New York has had a lot of outbreaks as a result of cooling towers out there, and most recently just this past year, and effective this year, they had stated that the cooling towers were to be tested at startup in every 90 days while in operation. But as of this year, they are moving effective this month to monthly testing to ensure that they don't get these outbreaks, these large outbreaks, because they've happened in Harlem and Brooklyn in the last 2 years, and there's been a lot of cases associated with that. So it does apply to university, large campus, and some school facilities if they have the cooling tower. So just make sure you know your regulations. New Jersey has actually been, they're kind of falling in line with New York. And I will tell you folks that once we see regulations start in one state or another, that more and more start adapting to these. And so obviously, it's very important that you make sure New Jersey did do a new Senate Bill 2188. It got signed into public law back in 2024 as a comprehensive public health measure designed to prevent and control the Legionella growth of Legionella bacteria. It does apply to all buildings, hospitals, nursing homes, residential buildings with centralized hot water systems. So, obviously, if you have dorms, that would fall into that has centralized hot water system. Obviously, the buildings with cooling towers, whirlpools, and spas. So just make sure that you know the laws for your state. Obviously, you can always reach out if you have a question. We are more than happy to help with that. Illinois, they within the they did a new public law that went into effect on April 27th of 2021, and that law required hospitals and nursing care facilities to develop a policy for Legionella testing. So there's a requirement for testing. They want you to have a plan in place, and they want you to have it set in stone in writing as a policy as to when you're going to test, where you're going to test, and how often you're going to test. So the best practice for testing, folks, is on a quarterly basis, because obviously water quality can change extremely fast within a building system. And so the sooner you catch it, the better you are off. But most facilities elect to do once or twice a year, but just know that the best practice would be on a quarterly basis. Michigan also moved into the world of back in 2020 for health facilities to establish and implement water management plan programs based on the ASHRAE 188 standard. The code did state that the management program must include a risk assessment, control measures, and ongoing verification. So making sure that documentation is there. If a facility was to happen to have a secondary or supplemental domestic water treatment, that they also must register and comply with the Michigan Safe Drinking Water, which would be having basically a licensed operator to help, oversee those types of systems. There are typically additional testing that's required and must be reported to like the Department of Environmental Agency. So just make sure that if you don't know your codes, that you do become very familiar with those codes. Um, Building a sustainable water management program. So, obviously I've kind of already talked about the key components of a water management plan. And that's just making sure that you establish a water management team, people that are going to actually be responsible and follow through with the program and making sure that it's being accomplished. You do have to describe your water system. So how the water comes in from the city water supply, how it's distributed among your cold water system, to how it's distributed through your hot water system, and actually how it exits your building. You have to physically have a written description of that. And then you also have to have a flow diagram of that to match with the written description, just to really show how it's being done. The hazard analysis, you can go through, there's a multitude of questions that can be asked. We actually reference the CDC's, what we call their LEAP form. It stands for the Legionella Environmental Assessment Form. for a review of your water system. You kind of go through and answer a bunch of questions and describe your systems and take some parameters and whatnot as a part of your hazard analysis. From there, that's what leads to your control measures, and then you start your monitoring and making sure documentation, implementing of corrective actions, and then verification and validations. Those all have to be a part of an ASHRAE compliant water management plan. Campus-wide water management plans, they really are based off of the ASHRAE compliant water management plan, and a lot of them are, water systems are typically interconnected there on campus buildings. And so you want to make sure that, you can take a simple water management plan, and as long as you have all the control measures, you can kind of spread it out to match your campus-wide program and making sure that it falls in line. All right, so now that you're following all of the steps and you have an ASHRAE compliant water management plan in place and you're doing all the right things, guess what? Now you're getting a phone call. The Department of Health calls, and they're going to tell you you have a case. So now what? Obviously, it now starts as a case investigation. They typically tell you to get an environmental consultant involved. The Department of Health's involvement and requirements are often very rigorous, with the water restrictions, um, and how they want to proceed forward with environmental testing and to get an environmental consultant involved. They're going to want to see a risk assessment that gets conducted, making sure that you have a water management plan in place, that you have the control measures and that they're properly documented, and that you're showing the history of the completed control measures. In some cases, after all this is done and you do environmental sampling, it might lead to a remedial or hyperchlorination treatment that can be required based on the scenario. If you get 1, 2, 3 cases, they may automatically jump that you're going to have to do a treatment of the building just because the patient didn't, or not patient, but the student or individual that was a part of the facility may have been there for a long time. So it becomes a lot of rigmarole when the Department of Health gets involved. And then obviously follow-up testing typically involves like 9 rounds of testing. So typically what it looks like is bi-weekly for the first 3 months and then once a month for the additional 3 months. So it's like 6 months worth of testing. And that can be extended, because if you start seeing any types of positives as a part of those follow-up testing, that testing could be extended to include more testing. So it may become more expensive. Cost versus risk. Obviously, the cost of prevention is not that much when it's compared to the cost of being reactive. I will tell you, and I've had these conversations multiple times with various clients across the board. In most cases, the cost of getting a water management plan in place, doing at least annual testing, um, and monitoring of all this, you may spend $3,000 to $6,000, but when it becomes having to be reactive, those costs can become astronomical. Cost of chlorinations or hyperchlorinations or remediations alone have been anywhere from 25,000 up to $100,000 plus. And that's just for the remediation alone. That's not including, all of the follow-up testing. That's not including the possibility of having to add in filters that could be on multiple fixtures throughout the facility. And then there's ultimately the lawsuits. The lawsuits alone, we've got lawsuits that are going on right now, anywhere from $500,000 to up to $10 million. And that's because of negligence, not having a water management plan in place, or they had a water management plan in place and they weren't doing all of the control measures and all the documentation that needed to be done. So trying to be proactive is far better than being reactive. We do recommend, that facilities, campuses, universities look at their insurance, because in the instance that you do get a case, you may potentially have some insurance that will help to cover you in the event of a case, to cover some of these high costs. A lot of the times we found these types of insurance hidden in the form of a poison, pollution or a contamination rider that might be on your insurance policy. So you might want to check your insurance policies to see if you have them and have a conversation. There is Legionella insurance out there. Obviously, it is more expensive, but it's better to be safe than sorry and do this double check to see if you have it in the event that you would ever get a case, which we're always wanting to not have cases, but they do happen. So as you see here, this type of item may help with the remediation, it may help with the disinfection and flushing, your interruption of losses and legal and liability expenses. Um, so how can we help? How can IWC help? Obviously, we have water safety and water treatment. But under our water safety division, we have water management plans, Legionella testing, remediation, hyperchlorination services, risk assessments, compliant. We stay current with the compliance and regulations, and obviously we help with consulting. On our water treatment side, we do have cooling tower treatment, boiler chemical treatment, closed loop treatment, custom blend water treatment chemicals, compliance and regulations, as well as consulting on the water treatment side. And then we do have an upcoming webinar that is going to be happening in July, on July 9th of 2026, is what 50 years of Legionnaire's disease has taught us about water management. Obviously, it's been July of this year will be 50 years that the first case of Legionnaire's disease was diagnosed at the Biltmore Stratford Hotel out there at the American Legion Conference. And so we're going to take the time to just celebrate and talk about 50 years since the first case and understand where this came from and how it led. So, all right, I think at this time, I will turn this over to Rachel. I think she's ready for maybe a Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Amazing job. Yeah, and when I send out the follow-up with the slides and the recording of this webinar, I'll make sure to add a link in there as well to the next webinar if anyone's interested in signing up for that too. Just looking at our Q&A here, we've got one. How long do filters need to be in place before we can remove them and go back to regular faucets and shower heads? I think this is referring to if they have them during, a case investigation.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So typically, if there's a case involved and you have to have point of use filters in place, we really take our marching orders from the Department of Health in this particular case. And it varies by state. It does vary by if we're dealing with the local Department of Health or the state Department of Health. If a remediation has been performed or follow-up testing is confirmed, like pretty much almost 2 consecutive rounds, so we're looking at basically a month at this point, the Department of Health may agree to remove those water restrictions. Some departments of health want them on for 2 to 3 months before they will allow. So ultimately, the filters in most cases, they come in a variety. They could be a month-long filter, a 60-day filter, some are 90-day filters, and then like filters that go like on an inline or an ice machine filter. Those are like a 6-month filter. It just depends on the style and type of filter that you have in place, and ultimately that removal, in the event of a case, will come as the result of Department of Health agreeing to allow those to be removed.
What effect has water conservation fixtures affected water quality?
Water conservation efforts. So that's where we were talking about the low flow fixtures, the automatic fixtures. Those have actually, they become problematic in the fact that they reduce flow. An automatic fixture has a timer on it. It may turn on, and run for 5-10 seconds while you're in, and that's not necessarily enough time to run out the line that leads to the fixture from either a header or riser. And so, we find those to be not good for when you're trying to keep waterborne pathogens under control. We would prefer to see a regular 2-handled or even a single lever fixture that you can actually turn on and get full flow out of it and allow it to run instead of it being on like a timer type situation. Now, some of the fixtures that are out there they might have the abilities, depending on the style of fixtures that you purchase, they may be able to be set to run for like 3 or 4 minutes, or even on a time basis, like once a week, twice a week, or something. If you have something like that and you can do that kind of set, that actually helps. But the ones that we've mostly ran into, they run for a short period of time, all based on motion, and they just don't turn over the water long enough. It allows more stagnation in the line
Is there an acceptable level of Legionella in a facility's water?
there. Can never say that there is an acceptable level of Legionella within a water system, because we don't know at what level, or even what we refer to as concentration of Legionella bacteria in the system actually produces the disease in a human being. So, there's no absolute answer to that. Now, there are some guidelines that the CDC has put out there, and their guidelines are what the testing that is reported in what we call colony forming units per milliliter, or CFUs per milliliter. And so from the CDC's perspective, they say anything that is less than 1 CFU, so zero point zero 0.09 or less, is considered well controlled in a system. Anything between 1 CFU up to 10 CFU is considered poorly controlled, and anything that's above 10 CFUs per milliliter is considered uncontrolled. And this is in a domestic water system. This is a potable water system, not a non-potable water system, but a potable water system. Um, and the reason we can't say, or they've never been able to measure, what level of bacteria produces disease in a human being. Obviously, too, all of the test methods out there, they do not, they have a limit of detection to them. So most of the lowest limit of detection we are aware of is 0.05. Anything below that is what they consider not detectable. It doesn't mean it's zero, because the limit of detection, it's right below that limit of detection. So, short answer is there's not a known acceptable level. We prefer to see the non-detectable levels, which means it's extremely low. But to know what actually causes the disease is unknown at this time. And being pretty straightforward with you, as a consultant, we have to look at several things when we look at the amount of Legionella in a system. We have to look, number one is, have we done a representative sampling of the building? Number one, is very representative. Number two, what kind of Legionella was identified? Anything that is Legionella Haemophila, we take to a higher concern. And then if a representative sampling was performed, then we use the 30% positivity rule of a representative sampling. Anything above 30% is actionable to try to do mitigation efforts against. And those are kind of like go along with the New York State Department of Health public guidelines that we take very seriously and follow up with facilities on those.
Can you touch on construction on college campuses and how that may affect Legionella in buildings?
Yeah, construction on college campuses, be it remodeling of a building, be it a new building being built, be it other construction within, even a mile to 2 miles, of a facility. A lot of times any type of vibration of the water mains can actually dislodge and loosen up biofilm and allow it to come and break loose and to be pushed into your system. And once that gets in your system, depending on where it gets, could really create havoc and create bigger problems. The biofilm that breaks loose, now it's going to get stuck somewhere within your system. And if it doesn't get flushed out, completely removed, let's just say it goes through your system and gets into an aerator, and then the aerator doesn't get cleaned for months on end. Well, guess what? Now you've created a bigger problem at that particular fixture, where you're going to probably have a lot of waterborne pathogens that have really developed. So when you're doing construction remodeling, especially if you're doing remodels, that if you're removing something, that you're able to take the plumbing back to either the header or riser to prevent from creating a dead leg.
And then we probably have time for one more. We've got a couple questions about the incoming city water. Is there any sort of filtration system that can be added to that to help with any sediment or anything coming in from the city water?
So there's you can do certain types of filtration on the front end. So in some instances, it could be very costly depending on the style and type of filtration that you like to do. But you definitely, if you can remove any of the sediment coming in from getting in there, like with maybe like a 10 micron filter bag or something that doesn't clog that easy, remove some of the bigger particles that come in. Um, there's not really a one-shop stop to take care of removing everything before it enters your building. There are multiple what we call supplemental disinfections that can help, add extra disinfectant to your facility on the incoming water. Does it mean it's guaranteed to completely remove everything before it gets to other areas in your building? No, there's not. There's no silver bullet really. But you can do extra steps. Adding some like heavier sediment built back filters, something that you would change on a regular basis. To if you needed to add supplemental just because you weren't getting enough disinfection, just to help get some disinfection into your building. All those things can be done on a facility's incoming water. It just depends on the kind of cost that you want to go along with that.
Awesome. Well, that is all we have time for today as far as Q&A. I know there's a couple that we didn't get to, but we can follow up with you individually. Thank you again, everyone, for joining today. And thank you again, Brian. If anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out to us. We're here. We're happy to help and looking forward to the next webinar.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.